You ever look at the person in the most powerful office on earth and just wonder, why can't they seem to get things done? I mean, they sign orders, they give speeches, they set these huge agendas, but so often that giant machine of government just doesn't budge. Today, we're going to peel back the layers and figure out why there's such a massive gap between a leader's command and what actually happens.
This quote from Harry Truman, talking about the guy who was about to replace him, Dwight Eisenhower, just hits the nail on the head. You gotta remember, Ike was a five-star general. He was used to giving an order and having it followed like yesterday. But Truman knew the White House was a totally different animal. He was basically warning him, this isn't your disciplined army, pal. This thing is way more complicated and stubborn.
So that brings us to the big question for this whole explainer. Why is it so hard? Well, the answer isn't just one thing. It's this complex dance between the leader, their own inner circle, and the very structure of the government they're trying to command. Let's start right at the top, with the leader themselves.
Okay, so the very first piece of this puzzle is the leader's own style. How they choose to manage people, how they process information. It has a massive, massive impact on how any decision actually turns out. A leader's management style isn't just about their personality, It's the system they build, whether it's formal or totally informal, for getting advice, for letting people debate, and for making that final call. It really determines whose voice gets heard, and just as importantly, whose gets shut out.
We can pretty much break these approaches down into three main types. You've got the formal style, kind of like Ronald Reagan ran his White House, very structured, very hierarchical, almost like a big corporation. Then there's the collegial style. Think Bill Clinton. This is more like a brainstorming session, a team trying to find a consensus that everyone can live with. And then you have the competitive style of someone like Franklin D. Roosevelt, who famously encouraged his advisors to argue with each other, basically to stress test every single idea out there. But here's the kicker. No style is perfect, not by a long shot. The extremes are where it gets really dangerous. Take Lyndon Johnson's super informal Tuesday lunch group for the Vietnam War. It was so unstructured that they ended up with these huge, disastrous blind spots. On the flip side, George W. Bush's really formal, corporate-like process for the Iraq War might have been so rigid that it stopped critical questions from ever being asked. See, two totally different styles, two pretty tragic outcomes. This chart here really lays out the specific dangers of each approach. So for example, if you have a really hands-on leader with a team-based approach, you're at high risk for something called groupthink. But if you have a more hands-off leader in a super rigid system, you might just get stuck in gridlock. The big takeaway here is that the choices a leader makes about how to lead directly create the kinds of mistakes their team is most likely to fall into. And that risk I just mentioned, groupthink, it's so important that we need to give it its own section. This is where we shift from the leader's style to the actual psychology of the team around them. The term was coined by psychologist Irvin Janis, and groupthink is basically what happens when everyone in a room wants to agree so badly that they forget about making a good decision. People start censoring themselves, they squash their own doubts, and they create this illusion that everyone's on the same page, and that can lead to catastrophe. The absolute textbook case of this is the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. You have the new Kennedy team, and they're under so much pressure to look tough. The CIA comes in with this plan to overthrow Fidel Castro that was frankly full of holes, and in the room, advisors who secretly thought this is a terrible idea didn't want to be the one to rock the boat, so they just kept quiet. The result was this false sense of total agreement that led to a complete and utter failure. It was beyond embarrassing. But you know what? The story doesn't stop there. The Bay of Pigs was an absolute disaster, but it was also a really powerful lesson for everyone involved. And that lesson was put to the ultimate test just a year later during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world was literally on the brink of nuclear war. This time, Kennedy did a complete 180. He deliberately fought against groupthink. He brought in outsiders, he made a point of not sharing his own opinion early on so he wouldn't sway the room, he put his brother Bobby in charge of making sure they looked at every single option, and he even assigned someone to be the official devil's advocate. Their only job was to poke holes in the group's arguments. A completely different process that thankfully led to a profoundly different outcome. So we've looked at the leader, we've looked at their team, but there's one last really deep layer to uncover: the giant grinding machinery of the government itself. This machine operates with its own rules, its own logic, no matter who's in charge. This famous line from political scientist Graham Allison, this is the key to understanding this whole thing.
What it means is that an official's opinion on an issue is almost always shaped by their job title. Where they sit in the bureaucracy determines where they stand on an issue. Their department's budget, their agency's mission, that's what colors their advice.
A huge part of this comes down to something called Standard Operating Procedures, or SOPs. These are basically the pre-written rule books that tell a department what to do in any given situation. A hurricane's coming? There's an SOP for that. Need to vet a nominee? There's an SOP. They're designed to make government run efficiently on a day-to-day basis, but they can make it dangerously rigid when a real crisis hits. There's this amazing story from the Cuban Missile Crisis where Defense Secretary Robert McNamara is just hammering the head of the Navy, asking how they're going to handle the blockade. And when McNamara keeps pushing, trying to get him to think outside the box, the admiral just waves the Navy's regulation manual in his face and shouts, "It's all in there." He literally could not imagine a scenario that wasn't already covered by the rules. That shows you the power and the total blindness of SOPs. So yeah, SOPs are a real double-edged sword. On one hand, they let organizations act fast and in a coordinated way. But on the other hand, they make these same organizations incredibly resistant to change. And they can be an absolute disaster when a totally new kind of problem pops up, one that's not in the book. And all of this leads us to our final big idea, the bureaucratic politics model. This model says we should stop thinking about the government as one person or one thing. Instead, think of it like a game with a bunch of different players, the State Department, the Pentagon, the Treasury, and all of them are fighting to protect their own turf, their own budgets, and their own idea of what's important. Look at this real-world example from the first Bush administration about agricultural credits to Iraq. It wasn't one debate, it was 4 different debates happening at the same time. The National Security Advisor saw it as a weapon against Saddam. The State Department was worried it would mess up their diplomacy. The Treasury Department saw a huge financial risk, and the Department of Agriculture, they just wanted to make sure American farmers were protected. 4 different agencies, 4 totally different agendas. So the final policy that comes out of a fight like that, it's almost never the most rational or the most effective choice. More often than not, it's this weird, watered-down compromise that nobody really wanted in the first place, but it's what's left after all the political horse trading is done. So let's bring it all home. A president can stand up and give an order, but that is just the first step in a very long journey. That order first gets filtered through the leader's personal management style. Then it gets shaped or twisted by the psychology of their inner circle. And finally, it has to survive the brutal tug-of-war between all the competing parts of the giant government bureaucracy.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating and maybe kind of scary final thought. When you see just how messy, how human, and how deeply political the decision-making process is, from the very top to the very bottom, you have to ask yourself, is a truly rational government policy even possible? Or is it always just the outcome of this incredibly complex and sometimes beautifully broken human machine?